Luke chapter 22, our study begins in verse 39 through verse 53. Would you read along with me, please? Jesus went out as usual. It was an ordinary thing, a normal thing for them. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, that place would be the Garden of Gethsemane, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he, Jesus, prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, that you will not fall into temptation." While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas," and I can't help but to go King James here, "betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" Remember, they had some swords last time. And one of them, we know it was Peter, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officials of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." Father, this is perhaps the darkest time in the history of our world. Significant for us, Jesus, because it appears even now to many of us as though darkness is reigning. But you see, that's only until you return to set things right. As we go into the garden with you today, Lord, may we hear from your Spirit what we need to do, what we need to hear. It sounds so inadequate to say thank you for your prayer, "Thy will, not my will, be done." That prayer, Lord, may your will be done in every heart here. I pray if there's anyone here in this service or the two that follow, if they don't know you, if they're not yet born again, I pray that this trip into the Garden of Gethsemane would fix that our hearts would be open to hear and to receive what the Spirit has to say. Add to your family today, Lord. For the rest of us, let us leave here today with immense gratitude for the price that you paid so that we could be with you in heaven forever. Bless this time. Speak to our hearts. We ask all of these things by faith in the most beautiful, wonderful name ever to be uttered from human lips. His name is Jesus. Amen. There's no adequate introduction for Bible studies like this one and the Bible studies that we will have subsequently. So I'm not going to try to do that today. I'm going to say two very quick things and then ask you to use your imagination. The first is simply this. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, in fact, throughout all of the Gospels, we hear Jesus saying things like, "Mine hour has not yet come." Every minute of every day of Jesus' life was directed for a single hour, that moment in time when he would accomplish his Father's will. This Bible study is that very hour, that moment, where the history of the world, your history, my history, where it all changed because Jesus was willing. The second thing that I want you to focus on today is using your imagination to go into the Garden of Gethsemane with Peter, James, and John. Now, we know we're going there with Jesus. He's there. That's the whole point of our Bible study. But there were three men there, Peter, James, and John, the inner circle, and they were in there. And unless you and I, unless we can get into the Garden of Gethsemane, then this just becomes a study that we've heard a million times. I want each of us to experience every moment of agony that Peter, James, and John would have had to deal with at this final moment, at this hour for which Jesus was born. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. Now, the garden was a place where Jesus and his disciples, the 12, would often go to be alone. They would cross the Kidron Brook. I'll talk about that in a moment. And they would go, and it would just be a time where they could have some quiet time. Jesus would often go here to pray with his Father. He would send his disciples there so that they could pray. Well, this was one of those times. John's Gospel is the one that tells us that he crossed the Kidron Brook to arrive at this destination. Now, in Jesus' mind and heart, he would certainly be thinking of King David here. Israel's greatest king would have crossed the very same brook when he fled Absalom in Jerusalem. He would be met on the other side of this brook by a man named Shimei, who would curse him and throw rocks at him. And the similarity, I think, is important. Both kings, David and Jesus, were kings without thrones, at least at this moment. They were kings suffering through what seemed to be the worst defeats of their lives. I mean, there's no upside here. And Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, is going to literally be all alone from this point forward. On reaching the place, verse 40, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." Now, I'm going to mention this only briefly now because I'm going to deal with it a little bit later. But Jesus isn't saying, "Pray for me." You know, we Christians, we have something going on and we beg people, "Pray for me. You have no idea the spiritual warfare. You have no idea the trial that I'm in. Pray for me." That's not what Jesus is doing. He's the one who's going to suffer. He's the one who's going to die. He's the one who's calling out for his Father. But he's telling them to pray. Why? So that you, Peter, so that you, James and John, will not fall into temptation. Now, from the other gospel accounts, we know that it was Peter, James, and John. Luke leaves that information out. This will be the third time that the three of them, what we call the inner circle, has been invited by Jesus into some very special places. All three of them dealing with death and Jesus' mastery over it. The first, of course, was with the raising of Jairus' daughter. It was Peter, James, and John who experienced that personally and up close. The second time was on the mountain of transfiguration. Imagine what it was like to be invited to go up that mountain and see Jesus transfigured before them, wearing clothes whiter than anything they'd ever seen before. And they saw the glory of God. And then, of course, this third time, and as I said, all three occasions deal with Jesus' victory over death. The first two times demonstrated Jesus' mastery over death. They should have known, Peter, James, and John, that as they were invited in to this deep place with Jesus, they should have known that his physical death would also end in victory. But as we'll see, their brains aren't working quite right at this point because of the emotion of the moment. It says he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Now, I'm not sure any of us can ever understand just how difficult this was for Jesus. I think when it comes to his suffering in the garden, when his crucifixion, I think we have a tendency, well, he was God, he could deal with it. I think we have no idea. He was contemplating for the very first time ever being separated from his Father. He understood, remember, that Moses and Elijah appeared to him on that Mount of Transfiguration and told him everything that was going to happen as he went to Jerusalem. So he knew that he was going to be forsaken by his Father. He knew that he who knew no sin was just going to suddenly become sin. He was going to take your sin and mine on him. If you think for just a moment about the worst thing that you've ever done, the ugliest, most wicked thing, Jesus became that thing for us. And for Jesus to understand this, I can never communicate adequately this, but even this idea of finality, how could Jesus, who always was, understand finality? And yet he was going to deal with all of those things. By far, the most difficult was separation from his Father. On 3 occasions, Luke only mentions this one. On 3 occasions, he asked if there was any way this cup could pass from him. In other words, Father, if there's another way out, let's take it now. Please, Father, if there is any possibility, take this from me. I say this often, but it demonstrates the reality that Jesus didn't go to the cross willingly. He went obediently. Have you ever had someone say, I can't wait to suffer for Jesus? They don't get it. Jesus wasn't looking forward to this. And yet he went obediently because he wanted more than anything else to please his Father. In life, certainly, but also in death and his Father's passion. If you don't write anything else down today, write this. His Father's passion was you. Write your name. And that's why there was no other way. Father, if it is not possible, this cup to be taken away, unless I drink it, may your will be done, was what Jesus' communication to his Father was. He was asking for the strength to finish well, to be faithful in the end, to be faithful in things that he doesn't yet understand. There are times when we simply must abandon ourselves to the will of God in order to see the glory of God. Now, I don't want to stretch this too far, but for me to send Pastor Chris and Elvira to Mexico is one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do here. They've been such an important part of our lives. We've carried them in our hearts for so long, and they have carried us in their hearts for so long. And we've known this now for years, 5 years we've known that this day would come. But there's something different about a day that's going to come. We know it's going to come, but it's 5 years down the road. I can't tell you how many times I must have said to Chris, Jesus will be back before that. But there are times when we have to just abandon ourselves to the will of God. One of the reasons we want Chris to be up here all 3 services today is so that people will be praying. Mexico is dangerous. They're walking into the unknown. It's going to be difficult for them. And yet they get it. They have to abandon themselves to the will of God in order for God to receive the glory. That's what Jesus wanted. That's what they want. That's what we want. But I got to tell you, it hurts. It hurts deeply. It hurt Jesus so much that his physical condition was so bad at this point that only heavenly intervention saved him physically. Verse 43. An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And the clear thought here is that Jesus would have died physically. His body was going to stop had the angel not come and ministered to him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, this is a fact that's mentioned only by Luke. Luke, who happens to be a doctor, thinks this is significant. When you sweat the blood, it's your body's last-ditch effort to cool itself down, to regulate body temperature. And that's how near Jesus was to death physically. This is when the full force of hell came against Jesus, and he had to deal with it in his weakened state. That's how great his physical and emotional stress was at this particular point. His moment, the exact one, had arrived. And God delivered him only so that he might die. That's really hard for me to deal with. I'm going to save him now so that in a matter of hours he will die. He will cry out from the cross, "It is finished." Now I want you to think about this from a human perspective for a moment. What earthly father wouldn't do anything and everything in their power to keep their son or their daughter from this particular moment? If your son asked you to save him, and it was within your power to do so, if you saw that he was going through something so difficult, so terrible, what earthly father wouldn't do anything and everything? In fact, a father who wouldn't do it, we would be harsh towards. And yet our Heavenly Father, because of his passion for you and for me, his Father turned his back on his Son. He who had the power to rescue his Son chose not to. How he must have wrestled God the Father. And I'm using human language because we don't have any other way to communicate. But how he must have wrestled with stepping in and stopping this torture. And yet he couldn't do it because of his love for you and for me. Verse 45 says, when he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep and exhausted from sorrow. Now this is another inclusion only added by Luke in his gospel. Again, this is significant because it's the only place we have an explanation for Peter, James, and John falling asleep. If we were to read the other gospel accounts, we'd come up with the fact that, those lazy guys, they just couldn't hang in there. They just weren't tough enough. They weren't watching out for themselves. But that's not why they fell asleep. They fell asleep from exhaustion. And that's why I want us to go into the garden with them for just a couple of moments. Peter, James, and John were, according to verse 41, a stone's throw away. How far away is that? Is it 20 feet, 30 feet? Is it 30 yards? We don't know, but what we do know for sure is that it was close enough that on a cool night in the Garden of Gethsemane, the sound would travel easily from one place to another. And what that means is that Peter, James, and John were able to hear every moment of Jesus' agony. They could hear him on 3 occasions crying out, "Father, if there's any other way." They were able to hear his body grow weaker and weaker. When somebody you love is hurting like that, crying from a depth that we can't understand, our natural inclination is try to make it better. It's going to be okay. Come here. It's going to be okay. They had no opportunity to do that, but they could hear everything. They would hear Jesus begging his Father for an escape route. They would hear him growing in anguish, both physical and emotional. And they would feel it. Sometimes the body's only defense mechanism against that kind of pain is just to fall asleep. And because it was cold, they would be bundled up, and that would be the natural response. And because they were exhausted, they fell asleep. I've only in my life experienced 2 things that put me to sleep. Grief is one of them, and sorrow is the other. There just comes a time when you don't have anything left to give when you're grieving or when you're sorrowful. And your body just sort of protects itself by falling asleep. My point is that the disciples had a good reason to be asleep. It is not an excuse for them. Jesus is going to deal with it in a moment. But they had a good reason. They weren't being lazy. They weren't being spiritually immature, as is often taught. They weren't oblivious to the significance of the hour. They had no other mechanism to cope. They were overcome by exhaustion caused by sorrow. Having said all of that, Jesus says this to them in verse 46. Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Now that may seem a little harsh to us. Jesus knows why they're asleep. Jesus knows what they're dealing with. And yet he goes out to them, and he did this on 2 other occasions. He said, wake up. Can't you pray with me even an hour? He would say. And the reason he would say that to them is because he alone knows what's best for them. Though they were going through something impossibly difficult, Jesus came out and told them not what they wanted to hear, but what they needed to hear. Again, I want to emphasize, he wasn't asking them to pray for him. He was asking them to pray that they can stay on guard, that they can stay alert. You remember from our study last time that Satan has asked for all of them, but Peter by name. And Jesus says, you're in danger. I want you to recognize that you're in danger. Now, next Sunday, we're going to talk about Peter's fall in depth. The steps leading up to it. Right now is a moment when Jesus is saying, Peter. You remember, some of you old enough, like I am, to remember there was an old aftershave commercial. I think it was Aqua Velva. And all you saw was a face, and then suddenly a hand would go, boom! And then the face would say, thanks, I needed that. Well, this is a spiritual slap in the face. Peter needs this. If Peter could have stayed awake, if Peter would have been on guard, if Peter would have fought just a little bit harder, who knows, maybe there wouldn't be the story of the rooster crowing. Jesus cared deeply for them even when he was the one who is suffering. Now, what I'm about to say is very important. It may sound as though I'm being a little insensitive. Trust me, I'm not. If you're here today and you're going through something really, really, really painful, and you feel like giving up, and you think, I can't take it for one more minute, one more day, I'm just going to give up, then you need to toughen up. You say, I don't feel like praying. I don't feel like reading my Bible. Jesus would say to you, well, that's when you need to read it the most. That's when you need to pray the most. We're going through something really difficult. If you're anything like me, and I'm sure you are, the last thing you want to do is do something spiritual. The last thing you want to do is open your Bible when the Bible and your obedience to it is sometimes the cause of your trial. But you see, that's when you need to fight the most. When you're hurting the most, because we have an enemy who is relentless, who is without mercy, you need to fight the hardest when you least feel like fighting at all. That's what Jesus is saying. You know, we deal often with people who are in crisis situations spiritually or emotionally. And they want us to hug them. They want us to put our arms around them and say, it's going to be okay. I'm going to pray. It's going to be okay. But that's not what we say. We say, this is when you really, really have to be with Jesus. When you feel like staying at home, pulling the covers up, staying in the dark, not going anywhere, not being with anyone, that's when you need it the most. And that's what Jesus is trying to tell his exhausted, heartbroken disciples. Those who are closest to him, he's saying, pray not for me, pray for you, because you are the ones who are in danger. Satan is actually going to use their pain and their sorrow to get an advantage over them. And we're going to study Peter's consequences next Sunday. Even if they don't have the strength to stay awake, even if they don't feel like fighting, they need to fight. This is the time to fight. Pastor Chris and Elvira, there are going to be times in Michoacan when you think, Were we crazy to come here? Why did we do this? Those are the times when you got to fight the hardest. Stay the closest to Jesus, regardless of what you feel. Emotions don't matter anymore. It's just being close to Jesus. The devil wants us to give up. He wants us to compromise our ministry. There would be nothing that the devil would want more relating to these two than for them to come back defeated. I'm sending tough people out there. And we're going to pray for them. The devil's also, in this particular case, setting Peter especially up for failure. Verse 47. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up. Now, John describes this as a detachment of soldiers. I want you to get this picture in your mind. In Jesus' day, this would be a minimum of 600 Roman soldiers. Think about that. 600 of Rome's finest and strongest come to arrest the meekest man who's ever walked the face of the earth. And yet that's the overkill of evil. And here's where it really gets dark. And the man who was called Judas. I'm not sure the language intends this, but when I read this, he was called Judas, but no longer he's now, according to Jesus, the son of perdition. And the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? At this very moment, Judas was just as filled with evil as Jesus was with light. It's hard for us to imagine, we have a tendency to think, Judas was really having a bad week. No, he was pure evil, inhabited by the devil himself to do this horrible deed, betrayal of the worst kind. It's interesting, and we don't get it from Luke, but we get it from the other gospel accounts. This kiss was actually a sign. A sign. You see, Jesus was so ordinary in appearance. And the Roman soldiers who came to get him, they must have thought they were coming for some big, really bad, evil guy. They had no idea who he was. And they would have made a plan with Judas. Well, how will we know which one to arrest? And Judas will say, look, okay, I'll give you a sign. The one I kiss, he's the one that you're supposed to take into custody. Judas didn't say kiss the one with the halo on his head or kiss the tall, handsome one. He said he's so ordinary and there's going to be people in the crowd. Here's what you do. I'll kiss him. That rocks me to my core. You've seen, we have a lot of people that kiss me and people that I kiss here. Can you imagine as Judas draws near to Jesus and he kisses him on one cheek and then on the other side of the cheek? Being that close to God and hating him passionately at that moment. That was the man who was called Judas. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them, again we know this is Peter, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now, this is a very serious study, but this would be funny if it weren't so serious. What do you do when you're in the middle of a trial? Isn't it true that figuratively speaking, we sort of draw our swords and we try to slay dragons instead of doing what God would have us do? Peter, the others asked, well, should we strike with our swords? Peter says, too late, I'm already doing it. And he proves that he's a fisherman and not a swordsman because he's trying to whack off heads and he gets only an ear. We know that servant's name was Malchus. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but think about Malchus. I'm 100% convinced he got saved. His ear is on the ground. And Jesus simply touches him. Heads bleed a lot. I imagine that Jesus not only put the ear back, but cleaned up all the blood. And while we don't have a record of it, this is the Ron International version. I think Jesus said, Peter, 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 enough of this, no more of this. And he touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, am I leading a rebellion that you've come here with swords and clubs? I mean, do you see an army? You've got 600 soldiers. Do you think this isn't just a little bit over the top? Do you think I'm going to resist? It's for this very hour that I was appointed. And then he says this, every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour. All until this point, he's been saying, my hour has not yet come. But he said, this is your hour when darkness reigns. And we know immediately at this point, Judas took off. He'd already arranged to get paid. All of it in secret, all of it in the dark. The plot to sabotage Jesus, all quietly, all under the cover of darkness. Judas pretended to be one of them when he was with Jesus, but as soon as he left, he was under the cover of darkness plotting his murder. And Jesus draws an intentional contrast. Now, as I close today, I want you to let this be a word that the Holy Spirit can use in your heart. Anything and everything you do in the dark, you need not to do. It's always evil when you whisper in somebody's ear. Did you hear about so-and-so? And you don't want anybody to know you're talking about it, but you do. You're speaking ill of somebody and you see them come and you stop talking. Anything you do in secret, anything you do in the dark is evil. We need to stop it. The computer passwords. The closing your computer. So no one will see the filth you're looking at. The drinking all alone at home, or the private use of drugs. Maybe the evil things, the ugly things that go on in your homes, behind closed doors. The language that you use when you're around people that aren't believers. Anything you do in the dark is a sign to you that your hour, the hour of darkness, has come. In contrast, what Jesus did, he did in the open. Everything was done in the light. The Apostle John will later, much later, write that because he is the light, we who belong to him must walk in the light. And when we're walking with Jesus, when we're walking in the light, then there's going to be good fruit coming from your lives. For Jesus, the arrest, the sham of a trial that is about to take place, were all done under the cover of darkness. As a man or woman who belongs to God, everything in your life needs to be an open book. Husbands, no secret from wives. Wives, no secret from your husbands. Your children ought to be able to see your integrity, your virtue. When I think about Pastor Chris and Elvira, having been through so many difficult times with them, I've never seen them handle anything without the highest degree of integrity. That's what Christians do. That's how we should respond to a Bible study like this. As you know, You've read ahead, Peter is going to fall. He's going to deny the Lord 3 times. Jesus is going to suffer and die, the most righteous man who's ever lived. That's what happens with evil. Now, you say, well, I'm not crucifying Christ. Paul says that when we sin willfully, we're crucifying the Son of God all over again. So what did the Spirit of God say to you as you and I went together with Peter, James, and John in the garden? We know how Jesus is going to respond. But what are Jesus' cries of anguish and pain? His pleading with the Father for another way, and the Father saying no. What did that say to you? How is that going to change you after having been in the garden for just a few minutes today? This is his hour. But the truth is, it's also your hour and mine. Would you pray with me? Father, as we close our first service today, this sounds so hard to say, let alone to make sense of, but Father, thank you for telling your Son no. Thank you for forsaking him. Because in forsaking him, you accepted us. And for that, oh God, we give thanks.